and welcome back to another episode of I'll Allow It Nevada, your go-to podcast for insightful glimpses into the Nevada judiciary. I'm your host, Seth Easley, representing the Supreme Court of Nevada Administrative Office of the Courts. On this episode, we're diving into a crucial but often overlooked aspect of courtroom proceedings, court interpreting. My guest today has had firsthand experience navigating this fast-paced and high-pressure world of court interpretation. Joining me today to shed light on the world of court interpreting is Jessica Escobar, a court interpreter for the Second Judicial District Court in Reno. Thank you very much for joining me, Jessica.
Good morning, Seth, and thank you very much for having me on the podcast. It's an honor to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. I've been wanting to do an episode with a court interpreter, so I'm very happy to have this opportunity to feature you on this podcast, and I'm very much looking forward to it.
Me too.
So to kind of kick off this conversation, maybe you just want to introduce yourself a little bit and tell our audience about your role as an interpreter.
Sure. Yeah. So I am Jessica Escobar, as Seth said, and I am currently the only, and for the last 6 years, the only full-time staff interpreter at the Second Judicial District Court of Nevada, which is in Washoe County. And so my job is basically standing or sitting next to litigants, defendants, et cetera, who do not speak English or do not speak it to a level of proficiency that is required to meaningfully participate in the justice process. And I interpret. A lot of people outside of the translation and interpretation industry call it translate. Mm-hmm. We call translating technically for written documents and interpretation for oral communication. So I interpret everything that's being said in English to them into, in this case, Spanish, because English and Spanish are the working languages that I use on a regular basis. And then anything that they say back in Spanish, I interpret into English for the court and the other stakeholders who are not Spanish speakers, and for the record.
Okay. It's we have a big topic here, court interpreting. It's a very important aspect of courtroom proceedings. So perhaps we can dive into some of the challenges court interpreters face in the courtroom or just in general. Yeah,
sure. I would say that one of the big things that is a challenge for certainly interpreters in any field and of any kind, and specifically in the courtroom is what I'm speaking about today. But I think there's a kind of a general lack of awareness of interpreters and a lack of understanding of what we really do and what it takes to do what we do. And it's not about feeling special. It's just that it's a very highly specialized field. And, there's questions come up sometimes from people that you wouldn't expect them to, like, oh, why is it necessary to be certified at all? Or why, or can't, such and such is bilingual. We can just, plug them in if there's not an interpreter. That doesn't really happen here where I'm working. I think the Second Judicial District Court has, is very professionalized in terms of how we use our interpreters here. And that's I'm sure been a process too that's been gone through with many of my colleagues before me and myself and everything, and the administrators and the bench. Everybody's been in on that, as a team, making this better. But unfortunately, I think that by and large, there is still sort of a lack of knowledge about what it takes to be an interpreter, and so and how best to work with interpreters. So, for example, the first thing I should say is that, being bilingual, for example, in itself is not enough to be an interpreter, right? It's a fantastic foundation and a necessary one. Mm-hmm. But first of all, there's various levels of bilingualism. And a lot of bilingual people themselves may not even be aware of that if they've never had to push their language skills to the limit. But the kind of Spanish or whatever it is that we speak at home that's not English, if that's the case, is not that level of language proficiency is not the same that you need to interpret. What's for dinner tonight? I left the car parked on the next block. I have an appointment at the doctor next week. That's not the same level of vocabulary, speed, agility that is required when, let's say, an expert witness comes onto the stand in the courtroom during a trial or during a motions hearing prior to a trial and testifies about a polymerase chain reaction or ballistics trajectories or any of these things, right? These are just examples. So that's number one, is like there's different levels of bilingualism. And then on top of that, interpreting and translating is a completely different skill than just speaking in a language, using words that to express thoughts that you're thinking. Now you're like a catcher and you're trying to catch all the balls that somebody's throwing at you in real time make sure you're understanding everything everybody's saying, you're processing it, and you're putting it out into another language in real time and in a way that makes sense in that language. I don't know if that was a very long-winded answer.
No, it's great. Yeah. There's a lot that goes into this profession. So I know there's a lot of things to cover. So and yet to your point of like bilingualism, this is not necessarily the same level as what is needed to interpret in a courtroom. Because even in someone who is going into a courtroom with like a native English speaker they're not familiar with everything that's going on in the courtroom. So it stands to reason that it requires a very high level of your language.
Completely. Yes. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's legalese, right?
Yeah.
Or if you're a medical interpreter, it's medical jargon, or any field. If you're a conference interpreter, you have to study up before every assignment. What if it's an agricultural convention? What if it's something about cryptocurrency? What if you need to very much compile glossaries for yourself and study the vocabulary of that specific field. And vocabulary, I think, is the more obvious thing to think about. But there's a lot of other little hobgoblins that get in there too. For example, there's very few what we would call perfect bilinguals. I think that's the name of it, if I'm remembering correctly. Like, was it perfect? No, balanced bilingual, I think is what it is. But it's a term that means basically a person who speaks more than one language at the exact same level. That's almost like a unicorn. Most of us do have one or another dominant language, even if it's very slight, right? But it's there's things that can creep into your language. And this will probably be familiar to any listeners who grew up in this or another country speaking a different language at home and doing all of their studies in the other language, for example, as I did, where your brain sort of starts to think more along the lines of one language than another in structures and things. So even if I'm speaking in one language, I might plug in words from that language into the grammatical structure of my other language. And I actually hear that a lot with kids that grew up from like Hispanic parents here and stuff. Like they'll speak Spanish, but it sounds like English grammar.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. They say like expression, and that's called linguistic or language interference. It's like the grammatical structure of one language is interfering with the other because they do have different structures. I have been asked by people, why do you need to have a copy of the document that's going to be read? For example, jury instructions that are being selected, right? And I say, well, because I have to be the one person in the courtroom who understands them best out of everybody, and to the degree that I can accurately relay them in real time in another language. And then I'm asked, don't you just listen to each word that's coming out of the judge's mouth and then just like find the Spanish equivalent? And I'm like, no,
that's not how it works.
That's not at all how it works. No. And I think most people who have been exposed to at least a language course, like would maybe remember that, but it's not something that necessarily clicks for everybody who wasn't exposed to more than one language growing up. But it's important to remember, like languages have different structures, different word order, different ways of saying the same kinds of things, different idiomatic expressions. So it's all very tricky.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've heard this brought up several times in different webinars I've worked on with the court interpreter program run out of the AOC, but something called cognitive load. And so this is a very cognitively demanding profession. So
yes.
Can you just talk a little bit about the cognitive demand of this profession?
Oh, yes. In fact, I think it was in 2001 that the International Association of Conference Interpreters even did like a study on this. And it was found that due to this and other factors, interpretation is actually ranked in the highest stress category of professions, right up there with, I guess, air traffic controllers, frontline infantry people, surgeons, like you wouldn't think it, right? You would not think that. It's not the stereotypical thing people think of, but it is actually quite challenging mentally. And that brings with it some stress that's inherent to the job itself, plus the additional stresses of, as I was mentioning, sometimes not working with people who properly know how to work with interpreters. So that adds extra things, or poor audio or whatever. But to your question specifically about the cognitive load, yes. I mean, think about it. Like when I've done presentations to like the Washoe County Bar Association or like the Inns of Court or whoever, I've done a couple of webinars also for the AOC, for the Administrative Office of the Courts. And I do like a PowerPoint where I show a picture of a bunch of people, just pedestrians walking on a street, right? And I say, okay, when we're all in the courtroom addressing lawyers and other stakeholders, when we're in the courtroom, this is what people are doing. And I show them the walking picture. And then I switch to the next slide and I say, and this is what the interpreter is doing. And now I show a picture of an athletic person like sprinting. And I see the eyes in the room open up like, what? I should always clarify, this is in no way saying that the jobs of the other stakeholders in the courtroom are easier or less important. That's not it at all. What I'm saying is that the cognitive demands are placed in different places, right? Mm-hmm. Like learning the piano versus learning the violin. Anybody can touch a key on the piano and it sounds good. Not so with the violin when you start learning it. But as you progress in your studies, the points of difficulty for the piano show up in different areas than in the violin. Mm-hmm. You have to play with two hands, playing different rhythms, for example, in different parts of the keyboard. Not usually the case with the violin. And it's the same with this. So with interpreters, our cognitive load is in that moment a lot too. I mean, we prep, sure, but in the moment, we are hearing everything everybody says, or whoever says it, hopefully with good audio and not mumbling and at a decent speed, right? Mm-hmm. We are using our brain to derive the meaning behind the words, which is trickier than you would think sometimes. Yeah. Finding the right way to say it in another language that makes sense in that language without linguistic interference that I just talked about, without word for word, choppy, weird sounding grammatical things that won't make sense to a native speaker in a natural way, right? And so now words are coming out of my mouth in one language that I'm listening to make sure that what I'm saying makes sense. But I'm actually still at the same time listening to the next thing that's coming out of the judge's mouth or the attorney's mouth. This is for simultaneous interpretation. Right. Consecutive is when we take turns, and that has other challenges like memory and note taking and not forgetting any details, right? Because we don't paraphrase in the courtroom. So that's why it's so hard. And we're not machines. We're not machines. The human brain is incredible. But and when you are taxing your brain to within an inch of its capacity, anything like not great audio that is fine for everybody else because they don't realize that their brains are compensating for the poor audio. Uh-huh. It's not okay for interpreters because we just don't have that extra bit of juice to give it. If your audio is bad and you're in an echoey room or your microphone is not the right kind or whatever, our brains have to work harder to decipher that, and we have to raise the volume and hurt our ears and do all these things. Mm-hmm. So that's why we do team interpretation. So we switch off every 15 to 30 minutes, usually 20 is the average. The United Nations does this. Like it's a standard practice. It's a best practice to deal with the phenomenon of interpreter fatigue. And there's a whole position paper on the importance of team interpretation that has been published online by the National Association of Judiciary Interpreters and Translators, or NAJIT. And they have other things on there too about best practices. So.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're enjoying this episode of I'll Allow It Nevada. We're always striving to bring you valuable insights and education, not just for judicial officers, but for anyone interested in the Nevada judiciary. If you find our content helpful or intriguing, please share your experience with your friends, families, and colleagues. Your support helps us reach a broader audience and ensures that more people can benefit from our discussions. Thank you for listening and supporting I'll Allow It Nevada. I'm guessing, maybe in the courtroom, people sometimes wonder why there's two courtroom interpreters. Do you get that question sometimes?
Yes, actually. Yeah. And I get the assumption sometimes when I come in with a colleague and there's, for example, let's say like in a family court case and there's two litigants, right, on opposite, maybe a couple getting a divorce or something. Mm-hmm. And sometimes when folks are new or they haven't had a lot of experience actually working with interpreters in the courtroom, they'll say, "Oh, there's two of you? Oh, right. I get it, because there's two people who don't speak English." And I say, no. Actually, we're going to be using the equipment because we do. Like, not every courtroom, not every interpreter has this, but I do highly recommend it. We give headphones to the people and a receiver unit, and we speak into a transceiver or a transmitter. And so that way one interpreter can interpret for several people at the same time. But the two interpreters aren't, at least not usually. It can be done this way. I think it's kind of a waste of resources, really, unless there's specific reasons, like everybody has their own private attorney that needs private conversations. The best case scenario is not always what there's a budget for or enough interpreters to do, right? But in an ideal world, fine. But a lot of the time we just, we make do with what we have. And there is a huge interpreter shortage, I think, in Northern Nevada. So we set people up with equipment, but the two interpreters aren't for the reason of each interpreter sitting next to each litigant. It's so that after 20 minutes, I swap in for my colleague. My colleague goes now, sits in the back of the courtroom, maybe goes to the bathroom if they need to or whatever, but mostly just stops interpreting. Right. And then 20 minutes later, then they replace me and so on. You're still kind of there in a supportive role, though. So if your colleague doesn't catch a word or can't think of the translation on the spot real quick, we can help each other out and pass a note if needed. But at least you're not actively interpreting, and that makes a huge difference.
And you said 20-minute windows? Is that what you said?
Yeah, that's usually,
minutes?
and there's different depending. So like if it's a very, very dense hearing, and a lot of motions hearings are like this, it's basically lawyers and judges talking to each other about law and very technical things, and sometimes very, very fast. Even when you ask them to slow down, they're not aware. And they're on a roll, and they're just trying to get their words to match the speed of their thoughts. And I get that. I'm terrible. I'm such a fast speaker. I would be a nightmare for an interpreter to work with. Truly, I understand this on a visceral level. From the other side of it, interpreting, though, I can tell you it is very, very difficult. It induces headaches very fast. It's very stressful. My heart starts to race. My face starts to get red and hot. That's it's very, very stressful. And so then the defendant is sort of listening to these arguments about legalese and case law, right? And I completely forgot your question. There was something. I got so wrapped up. I was like, but
no, you're good.
Good points were made, but what were they in reference to? What was your question?
I was just clarifying if it was 20. You mentioned the 20-minute increments for the team interpretation.
Thank you. I do have those tangents that I need to watch. Okay. Yes. Okay. So that was my point, was in a very dense, if it's very dense, or if they're reading a long packet of jury instructions and they're going a mile a minute or whatever, sometimes with some of my colleagues, we've switched out every 10 minutes, say, or every 15, because you've got your brain juice and it's going through it really fast. You're draining that battery faster than average. So, okay. And sometimes you can go a little bit longer, sometimes there's some videos that get shown as evidence or something. And maybe, the pace is okay. It's a family court hearing. Everybody's talking at a reasonable pace. The vocabulary is easy. You can hear without difficulty. So, but 20 is a good average, I think. And I think I remember reading many years ago that that's kind of what the UN goes with, for at least for their conference interpreters at the General Assembly and whatnot. Yeah, because they have field interpreters as well who do mostly, I think, consecutive, and that's a different thing. But it's still part of interpretation and still something we do in court, consecutive, for witness testimony, for example. But yeah, it's just how fast your juice runs out, honestly. And they've done studies too, where they say, because some interpreters will be like, no, I can just go and go and go. And, hey, I would say good on you, but they've done studies that show that at the point where an interpreter realizes that they're not quite catching everything, it's
too late.
It's not only too late, it's past too late, because that by the time you're tired enough to notice it, it means you actually started messing up way before that and you just weren't noticing it yet. It's just, and at that point, and I don't remember where I read that, but they've shown that, they've done kind of like studies on that. So yeah. So 20 minutes is a good average. I like it.
I do want to hear about the different forms of interpreting. Sure. But first, while we're on the topic of like mental fatigue and stuff, other than team interpretation, are there other strategies you do to cope with this phenomenon?
For the fatigue?
Yeah.
Actually, yes. I don't know if this is often talked about. I think it is maybe in interpreter circles. One thing that I find helps me a lot is how much I prepare in advance. So it is a very different story, Seth. If I walk into a hearing that just came up on the calendar that nobody knew needed an interpreter because nobody had asked for one, for example, and I'm available, I'm on staff, right? And I get sent to something, if I'm sort of there without having read any of the case documents, I usually try to read a little bit, right? But if I'm just like handed this assignment and I haven't prepared and it's something quite specific, then it's harder, much harder to understand what everybody's saying and to keep up with it and to find the vocabulary. And, not in every case. So, oh gosh, there's an emergency child support case. Okay. I mean, in a way, you've seen one child support hearing, you've seen them all, and it's the same kinds of repetitive questions and answers, and it's a lot of numbers and whatnot. But case law, motions hearings, witness testimony, things like that, it's very, very helpful if you, as you always should, as a professional interpreter, you should review as many of the relevant case files as you can get your hands on beforehand. Familiarize yourself with the sort of the logic of the arguments that the lawyers are going to make and the types of vocabulary that will be used, so that you at least know the gist of it, at least that much. And if there's any tricky vocabulary, that is going to help you so much better to reduce your fatigue before even having it. You'll still get tired, right? But you're going to get really tired and stressed out if you know nothing
Not prepared,
Yeah, because it's not just words. Like, you have to understand where they're going with this. Like, there's a lot of legalese that's going to come out of their mouths, but do you at least know where it's going and what it's in reference to? Do you remember having seen the names of the people involved in the lawsuits that they're going to mention? Because that helps. Like, every little bit extra that you have to strain to, well, what was the name that they just said? Or what was the date? Or what was the reference, the legal citation number? Every little bit that you strain is chipping away at that reserve.
Right.
The more you can have that done beforehand, the more prepared you are, the less, the smarter you're going to be about conserving your resources before it even becomes that big of a problem.
Okay,
That's one way, and maybe just meditate a lot too. Like, not even kidding.
You've mentioned there are different modes, different forms of interpretation, and I've heard about the different forms from my time working with the court interpreter program. Could you maybe just touch on those different forms of interpretation? Because I don't think people who are not involved in interpretation know anything about them.
For sure. Yeah. And I didn't either till I was an interpreter. Yeah. Really, why would you ever think about it, right? Mm-hmm. So the three main modes of interpretation are simultaneous, consecutive, and what we call sight translation. Mm-hmm. Simultaneous it's actually mostly what I've been talking about with you this morning, Seth, of where it's a big part of what we do in the courtroom, especially where the interpreter is standing or sitting next to a litigant, a defendant, what have you, whose first language is not English or maybe doesn't speak any English at all. And everything that's being said in real time is being interpreted in real time, simultaneously, at the same time for this person. I looked at my notes. Consecutive interpretation is, as the word consecutive implies, is after something else. So it means you interpret consecutively to or after what has been said. Okay. So this one is where a lot of memory comes into play, note-taking ability. This means you say a thing, you stop, I interpret the thing. Right. Etc. So it's turn taking. That's consecutive. And then that happens a lot, if there's phone interpretation, for example, and everybody's on the same audio channel. It would happen a lot in Zoom or virtual interpretation if we did not have the language channels, which thank goodness there were during the shutdown, because it makes things twice as fast. But that's consecutive. And I think the medical profession does a lot of this. Anytime when you have an interpreter in a small room with the participants and simultaneous is just going to produce cacophony, consecutive is more the way to go, I think. But in the courtroom, we kind of murmur interpreter. And then sight translation, which is you hand me a document that's written in one language and I read the document in another language. Okay. So And the trick is, and written language is quite a bit different than spoken language. So you kind of scan with your eyes. I'm also a professional musician. So it would be like, in a lot of ways, like what we call sight reading in music, which is when you're handed a piece of music you've never played before. And there's a trick to it. It's not something you've practiced. So you kind of scan it and your eyes are always a little bit ahead of the measure where you're at to see what's coming so you can sort of prepare. And sight translation is like that too. You're interpreting where you're just kind of scanning ahead for the structure of what you're saying so that you can put the words in the right order that are coming later in the sentence if that needs to happen and things like that. But yes, hopefully that was a clear explanation.
Yeah. So is there one mode that's more prevalent in courtroom proceedings?
I would say for sure sight translation is just because, I'm sorry, that was not what I meant to say at all. Simultaneous. I see. Okay. I would say for sure simultaneous because if you think about it, most of the people in the courtroom are speaking in English, right? And the official record of courtroom proceedings, at least in Nevada, is in English. I've heard different things. I'm not sure if California or New Mexico also does official records in other languages, but for sure in Nevada, the official record is in English, whether it's a court reporter who's taking that down and can turn it into a transcript later, or whether it's like a recording system like we have here called JAVS or something like that. But so most of the people are speaking English most of the time. So we are simultaneously interpreting for the people who don't speak English. But we also do use consecutive for witness testimony and for, if the defendant has a right of allocution at sentencing when they get to address the judge or anytime a non-English speaking witness comes onto the witness stand for the jury or for anybody. We're not going to interpret what they're saying to English at the same time that they're speaking in another language into the microphone because that's cacophony. So we wait for them to stop, and we're not going to like whisper it because everybody in the courtroom needs to hear it. So it's a different scenario. So we wait until they say their bit, and then we interpret it. So that's consecutive. And then side translation, we get that a lot too, honestly. We have guilty plea memoranda and the information, as we call it in Washoe County, which is like, where it shows the crimes that somebody's being accused of and all kinds of things. So, but I would say simultaneous is like 90% of it at least. Yeah, easily.
No part of it sounds easy. Let me say that, but that sounds particularly challenging.
And I'm glad to hear you say that. Honestly, for me, it's my favorite kind and the least difficult. And I don't know if it's because, well, I do know. We get more practice in it, maybe, but sure. But honestly, I think it's easier than consecutive. Like I'm not going to lie. I dread consecutive. During the pandemic, I moved heaven and earth to like make sure that everybody in this court learned how to use the Zoom simultaneous interpretation channels. And of course, it's because it's more efficient and it's twice as fast and everything. But also, it's so much less stressful once everybody's set up on it, which can be quite stressful in itself because you're relying on everybody to individually on their own Zoom device connect to the language channel, and it can be tricky on certain smartphones and when people aren't tech savvy and whatnot. But once everybody's properly set up, it is, I don't know, some people maybe love consecutive interpretation. Consecutive interpretation, you have to really rely a lot on memory and note taking, and you have to rely on people not talking for 15 minutes straight. Right. And that's really hard for people. Or they get into questions and answers. And the judge asks a question, the person immediately answers, and then the judge immediately answers, and so on. And you have to, you have to sort of cut in, which not everybody's comfortable doing, but unfortunately has to be done because everything needs to be interpreted. And people forget that the interpreter is there, which in a way is ideal. We don't want to be part of the conversation, but for consecutive, you do have to remember we're there and allow us to interpret after everything that's said. So
that makes sense. I mean, I can see where that, I wouldn't think about that. So, but yeah, you can be trying to memorize very long sentences, phrases, and conversations
with a lot of details and what we call false starts. I was going to the store So what happened was like, he pulled out the car, the brake shift, and then you're like, oh my, and you have to say all of that. You have to say all of that. And you have to preserve what we call the register, especially if you're in front of a jury. You can't make people sound more educated or less educated than they're really sounding. You can't like put words in their mouth. You have to be really careful about that. And people who are emotional or on a roll, like with their argument, they get very frustrated if you stop them. And so actually consecutive interpretation is a huge like skill. If somebody's not afraid of it, they can make big careers out of it with all kinds of like State Department things and all kinds of important like speeches and things. And that used to be the way mostly too, before the equipment was invented. I think it was like at the League of Nations or something like that interpretation equipment really started being a thing. And curiously enough, that was also when the field shifted largely from male interpreter dominated, who would stand alongside speakers at the front of a stage and do consecutive, to female interpreter dominated, who would be in the back in a booth, like on headphones, actually talking into equipment. There's some fascinating anthropological, that was my major, one of my majors in college. There's some fascinating anthropological analyses that can be derived from the visibility of the interpreter and the gender assigned to it and what equipment makes possible and the sacrifices that are made and the pay and remuneration that goes along with it. I mean, that's a whole thing, right?
That is fascinating. That's a whole nother
that's
thing.
That's a whole other podcast episode. This time next week on
Tune in. Yeah.
I'll allow it. Exactly. Tune in. Okay.
A heartfelt appreciation to our guest and to everyone who has tuned in to this episode. Before we wrap up, here are a couple of quick, important reminders. For continuing legal education credit, be sure to complete a certificate of attendance and email it to jepodcast@nvcourts.nv.gov. If you have any questions, topic suggestions, or comments, we welcome your input. Please email them to jepodcast@nvcourts.nv.gov. We now have a topic suggestion form now available in the description. Please take a moment to fill it out if you have any suggestions. We value and look forward to hearing from our listeners. Stay tuned for more episodes of I'll Allow It, Nevada. This is Seth Easley signing off. Take care, Nevada.